Close your eyes and imagine a village surrounded by a dense forest. It is the depth of winter in the year 1245. The snow is thick on the ground. The rivers are frozen. The only light comes from flickering candles inside cold wooden homes. People huddle together for warmth, wrapped in woolen cloaks, their breath hanging in the air like smoke. There are no glowing Christmas trees, no fireworks, no supermarkets stocked with shiny decorations. And yet, despite the bitter cold, despite the hardships, there's a strange beauty in the air. It's the season of faith, fire, and festivity. The season of sacred time. Because to medieval people, the holidays were not just days off. They were the spiritual heartbeat of the year. In a time when life was short, food was scarce, and nature ruled without mercy, people looked to the calendar of the church for hope. These holidays brought meaning to the seasons, marked time with color and music, and reminded even the poorest souls that they were part of something divine. Every village, town, and city in medieval Europe celebrated holidays, but not in the way we do today. These were ancient, earthy, deeply sacred experiences. At the center of it all was a triad. Feasts, not just meals but symbolic acts of gratitude and generosity. Fire, used in ceremonies, processions, and rituals as a symbol of light in darkness. Faith, the unshakable belief that each feast, prayer, and offering mattered in the eyes of God. As we walk through this story, you'll discover a world where the year was not ruled by clocks or to-do lists, but by ritual, reverence, and seasonal celebration. From the icy glow of Christmas to the fiery joy of midsummer, from candlelit processions to secret pagan traditions hidden under Christian robes, the medieval holiday year was a spiritual symphony unlike any we know today. So, prepare yourself for a journey not just through time, but through a different way of living. This is not just about history. This is about memory, the memory of a world where celebration meant survival and ritual meant everything. Now let's begin, where winter was darkest and hope burned brightest. Christmas in the Dark Ages. In the modern world, Christmas often arrives with jingles, packages, and glitter. But in the Middle Ages, especially during the early centuries after Rome's fall, Christmas was something quieter, deeper, and far more spiritual. The season didn't begin with celebration. It began with Advent, 4 weeks of silence, fasting, and prayer. Medieval people saw Advent not as a countdown to presents, but as sacred preparation for the birth of Christ. During Advent, bells tolled slowly, people abstained from rich foods, and masses were spoken in hushed tones. Villagers gave up meat, cheese, and even eggs. They lit Advent candles each Sunday, and parents taught children the stories of the Virgin Mary and the star over Bethlehem, passed down orally, often the only education available to them. Midnight Mass, the sacred gathering. Then came December 24th. In stone churches lit only by torches and beeswax candles, entire villages gathered, men, women, and children, wrapped in cloaks with red cheeks from the cold. Midnight Mass was the centerpiece of medieval Christmas. The priest would chant in Latin, the incense would rise like a mist toward the rafters, and villagers knelt shoulder to shoulder on cold stone floors. Most didn't understand the words, but they understood the emotion, the feeling of divine presence, the awe of sacred light shining into the darkness. After the service, they returned home in silence, guided by the stars and their shared breath in the winter air. The Yule log, fire as sacred armor. Back in their cottages, families lit their Yule log, a massive piece of wood specially chosen weeks earlier. This log was not just for warmth. It was holy. It had to burn for at least 12 nights without going out, or else bad luck was feared for the coming year. People whispered prayers as the flame caught. Some families sprinkled salt or wine on the log to bless it. The ashes would be scattered in the fields come spring, believed to protect crops and livestock. In a world without modern science, fire was both literal and symbolic. It brought warmth, but also hope. It reminded people that even in the dead of winter, light could still be born. The Christmas feast, a rare and joyful relief. And then, after fasting, freezing, and praying, came the feast. For nobles, this meant halls filled with torches, long wooden tables covered in roasted meats, thick sauces, cheeses, and pies. Musicians played lutes, jesters entertained, and guests drank mulled wine spiced with cloves and cinnamon. For peasants it was simpler, but no less meaningful. A rare bit of pork or goose, some honey cake, and a mug of warm ale were treasured like gold. Even poor families might bake a special loaf of bread shaped like a star or cross to mark the day. The point was not extravagance. The point was gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for warmth, for faith. Gifts were modest, but deeply symbolic. Gift-giving existed, but it was nothing like the modern holiday frenzy. Children might receive a small carved toy or a dried orange if they were lucky. Lords gave alms, coins, food, or firewood to the poor as a Christian duty. Everything had meaning. A sprig of holly meant eternal life. A red ribbon represented sacrifice. Every gift was a symbol, not just an item. Music, merriment, and caroling in the cold. Caroling began as wassailing, groups walking from house to house, singing songs in exchange for food or drink. Some of the earliest carols were actually prayers sung in rhyme, accompanied by drums and flutes. Children played games with nuts and pebbles. Elders told stories by the fire. And outside, the wind howled, but inside, laughter rose like firelight on the walls. A celebration of sacred survival. Christmas in the Middle Ages was not just a holiday, it was a sacred act of survival. Every moment, from the first Advent candle to the last spark of the Yule log, was a prayer, a memory, and a hope. For medieval people, celebrating Christmas was not about luxury. It was about soul, survival, and symbolism. It was how they made sense of a harsh world, and how they found warmth in one another. Feasts and festivals of the saints. The medieval calendar wasn't built around birthdays or national days. It was built around faith. And faith meant honoring not just God, but the many saints who had lived, suffered, and died in His name. Every region, every village, and even every profession had a patron saint, and each of these had at least one day every year that was sacred. These were known as feast days, not always because of grand banquets, but because they were days of rest, ritual, and reverence. In a world that offered little relief from toil, these saintly festivals were bursts of light, woven throughout the year like stepping stones of celebration and hope. A calendar of the sacred. From St. George on April 23rd to St. Lucy on December 13th, these feast days dotted the medieval calendar. Some were solemn, others joyful. Some honored saints with local legends. Others marked important miracles, martyrdoms, or biblical events. The average medieval person might not have known the exact date of their own birth, but they always knew when St. Nicholas Day was coming, or when the town would gather for the feast of Corpus Christi. In fact, the word holiday comes from holy day, and these truly were. The day begins, dawn with the bells. At dawn, the entire village would be roused by the church bell. The priest, often the most educated man in the village, led the day. People dressed in their best, coarse but clean tunics, freshly combed hair, and boots scrubbed of mud. They filed into church, where candles flickered in iron holders and the scent of beeswax mixed with incense. A Latin Mass was held in honor of the saint. Even if the people didn't understand the language, they knew the story, usually passed down in rhyme or song. Some saints were celebrated for bravery, like Saint Margaret, who fought off a dragon with the sign of the cross. Others for kindness, like Saint Francis, said to preach to birds and tame wolves. Their stories were part myth, part faith, but always full of meaning. The procession, taking faith to the streets. After Mass came the procession, a public ritual meant to bring the saint's spirit out into the streets. Children carried long, colored banners. Musicians played flutes, harps, and drums. Relics, sometimes bones or pieces of clothing said to belong to the saint, were carried reverently through the village. Villagers followed behind, singing hymns. Some barefoot, some weeping, others laughing with joy. The streets were decorated with garlands, fresh herbs, and colored cloth. If the feast fell during summer, the whole village might walk to a nearby field or riverbank for a blessing. This wasn't just spectacle. It was believed that these processions brought protection, fertility, and miracles to the town. Shared meals and simple feasts. While grand feasts were mostly for the nobility, even the poorest villagers took part in simple celebratory meals on holy days. The church often gave out alms, bread, cheese, and ale, to those in need. Wealthy landowners might slaughter a sheep or donate wine to the church for villagers to share. People gathered in small groups, often seated on the grass or benches outside, using wooden bowls and eating with their hands. Foods like fruit tarts, honeyed oatcakes, spiced stews, and dried apples were popular on special days. What mattered wasn't the amount, but the act of sharing and being part of something larger than oneself. Plays, games, and holy laughter. As the sun climbed, entertainment began. Wandering minstrels, often poor performers who traveled from town to town, would sing ballads about the saint being honored. Some towns put on mystery plays, short theatrical dramas that told biblical stories or saintly legends. These were often acted out by locals wearing robes, wigs, and wooden masks. Children played games with sticks, hoops, or eggs. Young men competed in archery contests or mock jousts. The bravest might dress as devils or beasts in symbolic battles between good and evil. Yes, these were sacred days, but they were also joyful, filled with laughter and play. The sacred and the communal. Feast days were moments when heaven felt closer, but they were also deeply communal. In a world divided by class, labor, and struggle, these holy days offered something rare, a shared identity. Rich and poor alike were united in honoring the saint, sharing food, and walking together. It reminded people that even if they had little in life, they were part of something divine, something bigger, older, and eternal. These celebrations were not distractions from daily life. They were the very moments that gave life meaning. Pagan traditions under Christian wrapping. The medieval world was not born Christian. It became Christian. And that transformation wasn't sudden, clean, or total. Beneath the robes of the church, the Latin chants, and the flickering candlelight of monasteries, there still pulsed something older, more primal, pagan tradition. The church knew this. It didn't try to destroy every old festival. Instead, it did something smarter and more lasting. It adopted them, renamed them, rebranded them. It placed Christian holy days on top of ancient ones. It let the people keep their fires, dances, and wreaths, as long as they now burned, danced, and blessed in the name of Christ. This chapter is about that hidden layer. The one that reveals how feasts, fire, and faith in the Middle Ages were built not only on the Bible, but also on the bones of the old gods. Solstices and equinoxes, ancient rhythms reborn. Long before Christ walked the earth, humans were marking the passage of time with the sun and the stars. In every corner of Europe, from Druidic stone circles to Germanic forests, people celebrated the solstices and equinoxes, the four pillars of the natural year. The winter solstice, the longest night, was a time of fear, hope, and fire. The spring equinox celebrated the return of life to the land. The summer solstice honored the sun at its peak. The autumn equinox marked the harvest and the coming cold. These festivals were agricultural, yes, but also deeply spiritual. They involved rituals of fire, offerings to nature, and symbolic dances, asking for fertility, safety, and good crops. When Christianity spread, these celebrations didn't disappear. They were simply repurposed. Yule becomes Christmas. Take Yule, for example, the ancient Germanic celebration of the winter solstice. It was a time when the sun died and was reborn. People gathered in forests, burned massive logs, sound familiar? And lit candles to keep the darkness at bay. They hung evergreen boughs over their doors as symbols of eternal life, and feasted to remind themselves that warmth would return. When Christianity arrived, it didn't try to erase Yule. Instead, it planted Christmas squarely on top of it. Suddenly, the light returning to the world became not the sun, but the sun. The Yule log was kept, but now it burned in honor of Christ. The evergreens were no longer symbols of forest spirits, but of Jesus' eternal love. The outer celebration stayed nearly the same, but the inner meaning had changed. Astra becomes Easter. Another example is the spring equinox, which pagans celebrated as Astra, a festival of rebirth and fertility. Eggs were a sacred symbol. So were rabbits. Fields were blessed, couples danced, and old seeds were planted. And then along came Easter. The resurrection of Christ was placed right on top of Astra's timing. The name Easter itself comes from Eostre, the Anglo-Saxon goddess of spring. The symbols, Eggs, rabbits, and renewal remained. But their story changed. Instead of honoring the earth waking from sleep, the people now celebrated a god rising from the dead. It was a seamless fusion, one that allowed old beliefs to fade without being erased. The people were still celebrating what they always had, life returning. They just had a new story for why it happened. Midsummer, St. John's Day over the fire festival. The summer solstice, the longest day of the year, was one of the most important festivals for ancient people. Fires were lit on mountaintops. People danced all night in fields. They believed the sun's power peaked that day and needed to be honored. The church didn't ban this festival either. Instead, it declared June 24th to be the feast of St. John the Baptist, conveniently placed just after the solstice. Now, the bonfires were said to honor the prophet who prepared the way for the Lord. People still jumped over flames, still lit candles on rivers, still sang and drank, but now in a Christian context. The ritual stayed, the meaning shifted. The green man and holy processions. Look closely at medieval churches and cathedrals, and you'll sometimes spot a strange face among the stone carvings. A man made of leaves, vines spilling from his mouth. This is the green man, a symbol of fertility and natural life from pre-Christian Europe. Though never part of official doctrine, he survived, hidden in plain sight in Christian buildings as if the old gods had been carved into the new religion's very bones. Even processions on feast days, where villagers carried torches or wreaths, echoed older customs. Rituals meant to bless the land, appease spirits, and ensure survival. Over time, these became prayers to saints, offerings to Mary, or dramatizations of Christ's story, but their structure and spirit were ancient. Folk magic, saints, and the blurred line. In villages, the local priest was often a spiritual leader, but so was the village wise woman or healer. People might light candles at church on St. Lucy's Day, and then leave an offering of oats on their doorstep, just in case the spirits of the woods were watching. These weren't contradictions, at least not to the people living them. Medieval belief was fluid, practical, and symbolic. The line between pagan and Christian was blurred, and the church allowed this for centuries as long as the people's hearts were directed toward God. Many saints themselves absorbed traits from older deities. Brigid, for example, a Celtic goddess of fertility and fire, became Saint Brigid, a beloved figure in Ireland. She kept her same symbols: cows, fire, healing wells. But now her power came from Christ. Harvest festivals, from spirit to sacrament. One of the most deeply embedded pagan customs was the harvest celebration, a thank you to the earth for its gifts. People once made offerings to spirits of the grain, held dances in the fields, and baked symbolic breads shaped like suns or animals. In the Christian era, this became Lammas, loaf mass, in early August. Now, instead of an offering to the earth goddess, the first loaf of bread was taken to church and blessed by a priest. The food still carried power. But now it was sacramental, not spiritual. Survival through adaptation. The church didn't defeat paganism by force. It absorbed it, transformed it, made it its own. And because of that, the medieval world became a beautiful patchwork of beliefs, part ancient, part Christian, but entirely human. Villagers might pray to Saint Anthony to find a lost cow, and also hang a rowan branch on the barn to keep away spirits. They might sing hymns in church and then dance barefoot around a maypole. No one saw a contradiction. Life was too short to divide magic from miracle. The pagan soul of Christian celebration. So when we speak of medieval holidays, we're not just talking about saints, mass, or the Bible. We're talking about layered stories, inherited rituals, and the resilience of memory. Every flame lit at midsummer, every wreath hung at Yule, every loaf blessed at Lammas, carried the DNA of older gods, older hopes, and older fears. The church may have written new words, but the people never forgot the tune. Food, drink, and holiday indulgence. In the Middle Ages, food wasn't just fuel, it was fate. For most of the year, people ate what they could, when they could, with little variety. Hunger was constant, meals were meager, and indulgence was rare. But on holy days, those sacred pauses in the rhythm of struggle, food became a spiritual gift, a community event, and a moment of emotional release. Feasting wasn't just celebration, it was a declaration: we are alive. We made it. And today we eat like God is watching. From grand halls to peasant huts, the holiday table was transformed. And while the rich and poor dined differently, they both shared one thing: the belief that what they ate was sacred. The daily reality: hunger, simplicity, and repetition. To understand the impact of feasting, we must first understand the ordinary. For the average medieval peasant, daily meals were humble. Breakfast might consist of coarse bread dipped in weak ale. Lunch could be a bowl of pottage, a thick soup made from barley, peas, onions, and whatever herbs or roots were available. Dinner was more of the same. Meat was rare. Dairy was seasonal. Fresh fruit was a luxury. And spices were unheard of, unless one lived near a monastery or manor. For the poorest, entire seasons could pass without a taste of fat, sugar, or strong drink. So when feast days arrived, the change was overwhelming. The holiday table, symbol of heaven. During holidays, food became ritual. On Christmas, roast pork or goose was prized. At Easter, lamb symbolized Christ's sacrifice. On saints' days, dishes were chosen based on the saint's story or region. The church itself tied food to salvation. Bread and wine represented the body and blood of Christ. Fasting before feasts created anticipation, so that when food was finally served, it wasn't just eaten. It was honored. For the rich, this was theatrical. Banquets were planned for weeks. Long wooden tables were lined with cloths, trenchers, bread used as plates, and silver goblets. Peacocks might be served in their own feathers. Custards were dyed with saffron. Jellies were sculpted like castles. Swans were roasted and gilded. These weren't just meals. They were mirrors of paradise. Feasting for the poor, simple but powerful. While the nobility dined in luxury, peasants still marked holidays with joy. A pig might be slaughtered and shared among neighbors. A woman might use saved-up flour and honey to bake a spiced cake. Children might get berries soaked in wine, or roasted chestnuts with herbs. Lords were expected, sometimes by law, to give alms feasts to the poor. This could include bread, ale, cheese, or cooked meat. Even a hot meal of turnip stew with salt was special, because it was made with care. It was made together. It was made on a day that mattered. Symbolic foods, meaning in every bite. Many holiday dishes carried religious or seasonal symbolism. Boar's head, served at Christmas as a symbol of strength and victory over darkness. Eggs, at Easter they symbolized rebirth. Fish, eaten on holy fasting days, especially during Lent, as a clean protein. Simnel cake, a rich fruit cake with almond paste, often eaten on Mothering Sunday. Honey, used in spiced cakes and drinks, a symbol of purity and celebration. Even the act of breaking bread together echoed the Last Supper. And many families would say a short prayer over each dish, or make the sign of the cross before the first bite. Drink in celebration. Alcohol was central to medieval celebration, not in excess but as part of joyful ritual. Ale was the drink of the people, thick, dark, and nourishing. Mead, made from fermented honey, was a sacred drink in older pagan traditions and remained popular on winter holidays. Wine, often spiced with cloves, nutmeg, and citrus, was a festive luxury, especially for toasts or processions. During major feasts, it wasn't uncommon for entire villages to drink together at the town green or near the church, singing songs, exchanging blessings, and telling stories. Communal feasting, class differences shared meaning. In noble homes, feasting was about power and performance. The lord sat at the high table. Servants carved meat with knives as musicians played. Food arrived in courses: soups, meats, fruits, pastries, carried on silver platters. But for peasants, the power of food was in the gathering. Feasting was noisy, crowded, full of laughter and warmth. Families sat shoulder to shoulder. Bread was passed by hand. Children ran between legs. No one went home hungry if the day was holy. And no matter the size of the meal, a seat at the table meant inclusion. That mattered more than any spice or silver spoon. Feasting as spiritual act. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about medieval holiday feasting was its sacred tone. The church taught that celebration was holy, as long as it was done with gratitude. Even indulgence could be righteous if it honored God. Eating, drinking, laughing, all could be forms of worship, if they brought people together in joy and reverence. This idea, that eating well is not sinful but soulful, made medieval feasts not just culinary but theological. More than full bellies. So when we think of medieval holiday feasts, we must picture more than tables of roasted meat or clinking goblets. We must imagine a child biting into sweet bread for the first time in months. A village elder raising a mug of ale and blessing the young. A peasant mother carving meat with shaking hands, knowing it might be the last feast of the winter. These meals weren't about abundance. They were about meaning. They reminded people of life's sweetness, no matter how hard the world had become. And in that moment, just for a day, hunger was replaced with harmony. Cold was replaced with candlelight. And ordinary bread became a taste of heaven. Fire and light as symbols. In the medieval imagination, fire and light were more than elements. They were living forces, symbols of divinity, protection, transformation, and hope. In a world where darkness was real, dangerous, and ever-present, where the setting sun brought wolves, thieves, and spirits of the unknown, light became a sacred presence. Fire warmed the body, yes, but more importantly, it warmed the soul. And during holidays and sacred days, this fire was not just functional. It was ritualized, celebrated, and even feared. Every spark, every flickering candle, every bonfire told a story older than scripture and deeper than fear. The story of survival and resurrection. Living in a world of darkness. To truly understand the power of fire in medieval holidays, we must remember that medieval nights were pitch black. There were no streetlights. No glowing windows. A cloudy sky could plunge an entire village into inky silence. Darkness wasn't just absence, it was symbolic of sin, death, and danger. People believed demons and lost souls roamed freely after sunset. To light a candle wasn't just to see, it was to summon safety, to call on divine forces to protect you. That's why light became such a powerful spiritual tool, and one of the most central elements in medieval festivals. Candles, the flame of the soul. Candles were not mass-produced. They were expensive, often handmade from beeswax or tallow. To light one was an act of devotion. On sacred days, people lit candles to honor the dead, represent the light of Christ, keep vigil during night prayers, bless homes and livestock. In homes, candles were placed on small altars, often beside herbs, bones, or crosses. Children were taught to shield the flame from wind, as if guarding something holy. During Advent, one new candle was lit each Sunday, growing brighter as Christmas approached. And on Candlemas, February 2nd, people brought all their candles to church to be blessed for the year, symbolizing the return of light to the world. The Yule log, fire that guards the family. Few symbols are as enduring as the Yule log, a massive piece of wood burned in homes at Christmas time. But it wasn't just for heat. It was a guardian. Families believed the Yule log protected them from illness, bad luck, and even evil spirits. Some would carve crosses into the bark or anoint it with oil. It was lit with embers from the previous year's log, a sacred continuity, keeping last year's blessings alive. The log had to burn for at least 12 nights, one for each of the days of Christmas. If it went out early, it was seen as a bad omen. After the fire died, the ashes were collected and scattered on crops, placed in wells, or even kept under beds, believed to preserve health, fertility, and spiritual protection. Bonfires and public flames. Fire as festival. On feast days and solstices, fire moved outdoors. Bonfires were built in fields, near churches, or on hilltops. Entire villages would gather around them, dancing, singing, and telling stories. Children were allowed to stay up late. Elders shared legends of saints and miracles. Some of the most famous bonfire traditions were Midsummer Night, June 23rd. Bonfires were lit to celebrate St. John the Baptist. People leapt over flames for luck. Girls braided herbs into crowns and threw them into the fire to predict marriage. Easter Eve, a paschal fire was lit outside the church. From this flame, the priest would light the paschal candle inside, symbolizing Christ's resurrection, the light returning to the world. All Hallows Eve, though now known as Halloween, This night was originally full of protective fire rituals, intended to ward off wandering spirits of the dead. In these moments, fire was more than celebration. It was ceremony, protection, and prayer. Fire in church rituals, sacred light. In churches, the use of fire was carefully structured. At Vespers, candles were lit as day ended, signaling the transition to night prayers. On Holy Saturday, fire was kindled in silence, and the church would begin in darkness, slowly illuminating with each chant and candle until the space glowed with sacred light. Monks lit candles during readings to symbolize enlightenment, the flame representing Christ as the light of the world. In cathedrals, candlelight was not simply decorative. It transformed the space. Shadows danced on stone walls. Stained glass glowed. Worshippers were reminded that even in suffering, God's presence could shine. Fire as purification. Throughout the medieval year, fire was used to cleanse. On New Year's Eve, old clothes or household items were burned to banish the past year's sins and failures. During plagues, people burned herbs, rosemary, sage, thyme, to clean the air. In some villages, livestock were led between two fires on saint days to protect them from disease. Even illness was thought of as a kind of spiritual darkness. Fire could burn away sin and suffering. It purified not just the body but the soul. Symbolism beyond the flame. To the medieval mind, fire had layers of meaning. Light represented the divine knowledge and guidance. Heat symbolized love, spiritual zeal, and comfort. Destruction warned of hell, wrath, and divine punishment. This is why fire appeared so often in art, songs, sermons, and rituals. It was a force to be feared and revered, a reminder of both heaven and hell. Fire as a bridge between worlds. So when you see a Yule log crackling, or a child lighting a candle before an altar, or villagers dancing around a midsummer blaze, you're seeing more than history. You're seeing a people who understood that light is sacred. In their harsh world of famine, war, and death, they built a life that honored fire as the first miracle, the power that turned night into morning, fear into joy, and solitude into celebration. Every flame told a story. Every spark whispered of hope. And in their holiday rituals, medieval people proved that even the darkest night could be pierced by a single humble flame. Music, dance, and sacred performance. In the medieval world, where daily life was filled with labor and suffering, music and movement became a sacred language. A way to express devotion, release joy, and tell stories that words could never quite capture. On holy days and festivals, when work stopped and bells rang out, music wasn't just a backdrop, it was the heartbeat of the celebration. Dance wasn't a performance, it was a prayer. Every note, every step, every rhythm connected the people to each other, their land, and their God. Whether in the echoing stone of a cathedral or the muddy center of a village, music and dance were bridges between heaven and earth. The sound of the sacred, church music. In monasteries, cathedrals, and chapels, music had a strictly spiritual role. The most common form was Gregorian chant, haunting, unaccompanied melodies sung in Latin, flowing like waves through stone walls. The purpose wasn't entertainment, it was elevation. Chant was meant to bring the soul closer to God, to strip away the world's distractions and reveal the divine. These chants were often written in neumes, the early form of musical notation. Monks spent hours copying them by hand, crafting both the music and the sacred books it lived in. Holidays in the church calendar brought special hymns, composed for particular saints or seasons. At Christmas, choirs sang of light returning. At Easter, the chants exploded in joy, echoing the miracle of resurrection. Even illiterate villagers could recognize these melodies. They were the soundtrack of faith, heard at every baptism, wedding, and funeral, a reminder that their lives moved in rhythm with something holy. Folk music, the people's voice. Outside church walls, music was different, rougher, livelier, and deeply communal. Villagers didn't have choirs or organs. Instead, they used whatever instruments they had. Rebecks, early violins. Flutes and pipes carved from wood or bone. Drums and tambourines. Bagpipes in some regions. And most importantly, the voice. Everyone sang. These weren't trained musicians. But their songs were powerful. passed down by memory, changing with every generation. They sang of saints, seasons, work, love, death, and miracles. On feast days, music flowed through the streets. Minstrels traveled from town to town, singing ballads that taught history and moral lessons. Some songs were humorous, others tragic. All were alive, shaped by the people in the moment. Dance as celebration, dance as devotion. Dance was not just allowed in the medieval world, it was embraced, especially on holy days. On Midsummer's Eve, villagers danced in circles around bonfires, holding hands, laughing and leaping in rhythm. During May Day, they danced around maypoles, weaving ribbons in colorful spirals. These dances were rituals of joy, celebrating life, harvest, and divine blessings. In some cases, they were believed to bring good weather or fertility to the land. Even during more somber feasts like All Saints' Day, dances took on a symbolic tone. Some communities performed the danse macabre, the dance of death, a reminder that all people, rich and poor, would eventually die. Skeletons and nobles danced together in paintings and plays, warning of life's fleeting nature. Still, for most villagers, dancing wasn't a metaphor. It was freedom. Mystery plays and holy theater. One of the most powerful forms of sacred performance was the mystery play, a medieval drama that told stories from the Bible or the lives of saints. Performed on carts, in town squares, or outside churches, these plays were simple in language so all could understand, rich in emotion with devils, angels, miracles, and sin, often acted by locals, not professionals, full of music, chanting, and gesture. The goal was not entertainment alone. It was education, inspiration, and faith building. On feast days, entire towns would gather to watch the Passion of Christ, the fall of Lucifer, or the miracles of St. Catherine. The audience wept, cheered, and prayed. It was theater, but also sacrament. Some monasteries even composed liturgical dramas to be performed inside the church, complete with robes, incense, and antiphonal singing. In these moments, the line between art and worship disappeared. Minstrels and troubadours, carriers of holiday spirit. Minstrels were often the lifeblood of festivals. These wandering musicians and storytellers brought news, legends, and celebration to isolated towns. On holidays they might perform epic ballads of saints or fallen knights, romantic poems about divine love or courtly devotion, humorous tales mocking pride or greed. Some played harps or lutes, others beat simple drums. A talented minstrel could move an entire crowd to tears, laughter, or repentance. Though not always welcomed by the church, some were seen as disruptive. Minstrels served an important spiritual function. They helped people remember. Through story and song, they preserved the rhythms of the sacred year. Sacred movement beyond the village. In cities and noble courts, holiday celebrations were more formal. Musicians were often trained, dancers rehearsed. Nobles might perform choreographed processions, with each movement representing a virtue or biblical theme. Some monks practiced sacred gestures during prayer, raising arms in rhythm with chant, bowing on key syllables, or walking in silent circles around altars. Even the act of pilgrimage, walking to a holy site, was viewed as a kind of spiritual dance, a movement of the whole body toward God. When the soul speaks in song and step. In medieval holidays, music and dance were not distractions. They were devotion in motion. They allowed people, even the poorest, even the voiceless, to express longing, gratitude, joy, and sorrow. They turned doctrine into experience. They took the invisible and made it audible, visible, and shared. When villagers sang by firelight, when children danced barefoot in fields, when choirs lifted hymns into cathedral ceilings, they were doing more than celebrating. They were weaving themselves into the divine rhythm of the year. And in those fleeting, fragile moments, they became more than farmers or bakers or carpenters. They became instruments of praise, living liturgies, sacred stories told through song and step, clothing, color, and holiday pageantry. In a time when most days were gray and most lives were hard, color became a kind of magic. And nothing brought out that magic more than a medieval holiday. Clothing wasn't just practical, it was symbolic, hierarchical, and deeply ritualistic. On sacred days, people didn't just worship. They dressed to be seen by God, neighbors, and history. The feast days of the medieval calendar turned ordinary villages into theaters of transformation. Through dyes, flowers, symbols, and rich fabric, even the poorest could take part in the visual symphony of holy celebration. The reality of daily dress. To appreciate the splendor of holiday dress, we must start with the contrast. Everyday clothing in the Middle Ages was simple, coarse, and repetitive. Most peasants owned just one or two garments. A tunic for men. A kirtle or gown for women. Wool or linen, often undyed or naturally brown, gray or off-white. Leather boots or wooden clogs. A belt, sometimes a hood or cloak in winter. Washing was rare. Dyes faded. Repairs were constant. Clothing told the world your place in society, and for most, that place was near the bottom. So when holidays came, the transformation was stunning. Color, a language of celebration. Color in medieval times was expensive, especially vibrant tones. Red was tied to power, blood, and joy, used in weddings and Christmas. Blue symbolized purity and the Virgin Mary. Green represented fertility and spring, worn at May Day and Easter. Gold and yellow signified light, divinity, and harvest. White was for innocence, worn by brides and children on holy days. Even the dyes were symbolic. Woad made deep blues but took weeks to set. Madder root gave rusty reds and oranges. Saffron and weld created golden tones, so costly they were reserved for nobility. Peasants might only wear colorful clothing a few times a year. Some dyed old garments with crushed berries or herbs just for the festival. Others borrowed or traded with neighbors to brighten their appearance. On feast days, even color was an offering. Accessories and adornment. The medieval holiday look went far beyond tunics and cloaks. Wreaths of flowers and herbs were worn on the head, symbols of nature, youth, and renewal. Ribbons and braided cords were tied around arms or waists, often embroidered with Christian symbols like crosses or doves. Jewelry, if owned, was proudly displayed, especially family heirlooms or religious medallions. Pins and brooches, even simple bone or bronze ones, were prized. In noble courts, garments were adorned with fur, pearls, metal threads, and gems. Silks were imported from Italy or the East, worn more as status symbols than clothing. But even the simplest villager might wear a beaded belt, a dyed veil, or a flower crown, transforming daily drudgery into sacred beauty. Seasonal symbols and dress. Clothing on holidays often matched the themes of the season. At Easter, people wore green and white, carried herbs like rosemary, and sometimes stitched eggs or lambs into their garments. At midsummer, sun wheels or flame symbols were embroidered or painted on tunics. At All Saints' Day, mourners wore dark veils, but might stitch stars or candle shapes as symbols of resurrection. On Christmas, red cloaks and pine sprigs were popular, and children might wear tiny wooden crosses or bells. These details were not just decorative, they were spiritual signals, worn on the body to announce one's part in the sacred story of the year. Processions and pageantry. One of the most visually stunning elements of medieval holidays was the procession, a moving parade of villagers, clergy, children, and nobles, all dressed for the occasion. Priests wore vestments in symbolic colors, purple for Lent, gold for Easter. Banners embroidered with saints or Christ were carried high. Children might wear wings and halos to represent angels. Singers and musicians led the group, dressed in coordinating colors. Lay people followed in their best clothes, holding candles, flowers, or painted signs. On saints' days, some people dressed as the saint, complete with armor, shepherd's crooks, or crowns of thorns. Others portrayed biblical figures in mystery plays, turning fabric and face paint into divine characters. This wasn't costume, it was identity. Through clothing, people stepped into their roles in sacred time. Special dress for special roles. Certain people had unique clothing responsibilities. The May Queen on May Day wore white with flowers and led the dancing. The Lord of Misrule, during Christmas revels, dressed in jester's clothes, mocking power and flipping social norms. Flagellants, during plagues or Lent, wore sackcloth and hoods, sometimes even walking barefoot, their pain meant to imitate Christ's. Nobles might finance an entire town's pageantry, hiring tailors, buying bolts of cloth, or gifting children new shoes just for the holiday. Dressing up was not vanity. It was ritual investment, a material way to honor the divine and participate in communal joy, dressing the soul in color. In the cold stone of the medieval world, color was warmth. In poverty it was pride. In suffering it was celebration. When medieval people dressed for holidays, they weren't pretending to be someone else. They were becoming their truest selves, visible, vibrant, and temporarily lifted from the burdens of life. Their clothing whispered old stories. Their colors echoed forgotten gods and new saints. And in those sacred moments of fabric and thread, they stepped into the drama of faith with every stitch. A cloak was never just a cloak. A flower was never just a flower. It was worship made visible. The role of the church and clergy in holiday life. In the Middle Ages, the church was not just a place. It was the center of time, belief, and community life. It marked the seasons. It defined the year. And when it came to holidays, nothing happened without the church's blessing. To the medieval person, there was no such thing as a holiday without holy meaning. Every celebration, every feast, every performance and procession was rooted in sacred order, and the clergy were its keepers. They didn't just host the holidays, they authored them, choreographed them, and stood at their heart, guiding souls through joy, repentance, and revelation. The liturgical calendar, the church's sacred clock. Time in the medieval world didn't revolve around months or weekdays. It revolved around the liturgical calendar, the church's map of sacred time. This calendar divided the year into seasons of meaning. Advent, waiting for Christ. Christmas, Epiphany. Lent, fasting and preparation. Holy Week, Easter, Pentecost. Ordinary time, the long green season of spiritual growth. Each season had specific feasts, colors, scriptures, and rituals. Villagers didn't need to know the date. They only needed to see the color of the priest's robe, hear the chants, or smell the incense to know what holy time they were walking through. The church taught that to celebrate properly was to be in sync with God's story. Clergy as spiritual directors of celebration. Priests, monks, bishops, and abbots weren't just religious figures. During holidays, they became directors of communal transformation. Their roles included announcing upcoming feast days from the pulpit, blessing homes, candles, livestock, and even wells, leading processions through town, delivering holiday sermons with parables, warnings, and joy, confessing and absolving sins before great feasts, conducting liturgies filled with symbolic gestures and readings. The church reminded people that joy must be holy, that celebration should be anchored in humility and grace, and that every meal, dance, and costume must ultimately point back to God. The sound of the church, bells, chant, and voice. The first sign of a feast day was often the sound of bells. Small handbells called people to chapel. Tower bells marked holy hours. Special peals were reserved for Christmas, Easter, and saints' days. Inside, the air filled with chant, ancient Latin prayers set to melody. Sometimes choirs would sing polyphony, layering voices like angels. On major holidays, these services might last all night. And every sound was sacred. It reminded the people that God was near, and that the heavens were watching their joy. Sacraments and special blessings. Holidays were seen as portals, moments when heaven touched earth. As such, the church offered sacraments and blessings that gave these days deeper spiritual weight. Baptisms were often held on Easter, symbolizing rebirth. Marriages were blessed at midsummer or Christmas. On Candlemas, people brought their entire year's worth of candles to be blessed by the priest. On Rogation days, priests led processions through fields, praying for a good harvest. On Corpus Christi, the Eucharist was carried in grand public processions, adored by crowds. Even simple acts, like the sprinkling of holy water or anointing with oil, took on deeper meaning on feast days. Fasting before feasting. The church also taught that true celebration must come through preparation. Before major feasts, people were expected to fast, eating only bread, vegetables, and water. Confess sins. Pray more frequently. Avoid luxuries, sexual activity, and indulgence. This period of discipline, like Lent before Easter or Advent before Christmas, helped build anticipation. The eventual feast became not just joyful but deserved. Fasting cleansed the soul, making room for divine joy. Monastic celebrations, a world apart. In monasteries, holidays were celebrated with greater ritual precision. Monks followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which outlined how to balance work, prayer, and celebration. On feast days, extra psalms were sung. Richer food was allowed. Guests and pilgrims were welcomed warmly. Readings from saints' lives replaced ordinary scriptures. The monk's example reminded the world that discipline and delight could coexist, that spiritual joy did not require loudness but reverence. The church and the poor on holidays. One of the church's most important holiday roles was to care for the poor. On feast days, monasteries and churches gave alms: bread, cheese, ale, and sometimes meat. Lords were expected to sponsor almsgiving feasts, often coordinated through the parish. Clergy kept lists of widows, orphans, and beggars who needed assistance. To serve the poor was to serve Christ. Holidays were seen as God's appointed time to ensure no one went hungry or unloved. Theological meaning of celebration. Ultimately, the Church taught that holy days weren't just rest days. They were echoes of heaven. Christmas was the beginning of redemption. Easter was the triumph over death. Saints' days honored heroes of the faith. Ordinary Sundays were little Easters, celebrating resurrection weekly. The clergy helped people see that every candle, every hymn, every bite of meat on a rare feast day pointed to something greater. A kingdom beyond time where joy never ended. Guardians of sacred joy. In the medieval world, the church stood as both gatekeeper and guide to every celebration. Through chants, colors, rituals, and rules, it turned days off into days of awe. The clergy didn't just preach. They sculpted the year, choreographed the joy, and ensured that every heart that sang, every hand that danced, and every table that overflowed did so under the light of divine grace. In their presence, even the most ordinary life could be lifted into holy drama, and every celebration, no matter how humble, became a glimpse of paradise. Chapter 9. Children and the Magic of Medieval Holidays. In a world often marked by hardship, disease, and early death, childhood in the Middle Ages was fragile, brief, and yet astonishingly full of wonder, especially on holidays. For most of the year, children worked alongside their families. But when a feast day came, something shifted. The village slowed. Music drifted. Bright colors emerged. And suddenly, a space opened where children could be children again. Curious, laughing, dancing barefoot on holy ground. To a medieval child, a holiday wasn't just a celebration. It was magic made real. The role of children in preparation. Even before the festivities began, children had roles to play. Gathering herbs and flowers for decorations. Helping knead special bread or shape festival cakes. Fetching water from the well for washing before holy processions. Sweeping the church floors, dusting icons, or arranging candles. These simple tasks connected them to the ritual structure of the day. Elders explained the meaning of each flower, each candle, passing down stories that children would one day tell again. In some places, children even knocked on doors before the feast to collect alms or invite neighbors, a medieval version of spreading joy. Special gifts and food for children. Though medieval children rarely received presents in the modern sense, holidays brought surprises. On St. Nicholas Day, December 6th, children left shoes outside their doors and awoke to find dried fruits, nuts, or tiny charms inside. At Easter, dyed eggs were hidden or exchanged, sometimes with small baked treats shaped like lambs or birds. On Twelfth Night, children might receive bits of sweet cake, or even be crowned as a king or queen for the day. Even a bit of honey, a dried fig, or a piece of meat could feel like a treasure, especially in poor households. These edible gifts were tied to deep Christian symbolism, often explained as rewards from heaven. Make-believe, processions, and play. Holidays were times when children could step out of ordinary life and into myth, miracle, and make-believe. On May Day, little girls became flower maidens with braided hair and fresh wreaths. On Candlemas, boys might serve as torchbearers in solemn church processions. During Christmas or Epiphany, some children were dressed as magi, complete with cardboard crowns and star-shaped lanterns. In parish plays, children portrayed angels, lambs, or baby Jesus in nativity scenes. They were not just observing the holiday, they were performing the faith, helping the community relive sacred stories through their innocence. Learning through ritual. Most medieval children were illiterate, but on feast days they learned the structure of the liturgical year, the lives of saints told in rhymed chants or dramatic plays, moral lessons about generosity, obedience, and patience, prayers, proverbs, and songs they would carry into adulthood. This learning was embodied. A child learned about resurrection not from a book, but by helping paint Easter eggs. They learned about humility by bowing before a saint statue in procession. Faith was lived before it was understood. The Boy Bishop, a holiday turned upside down. One of the most remarkable traditions involving children was the Boy Bishop ceremony, celebrated around St. Nicholas Day in many cathedrals and abbeys. A young choir boy was chosen to act as bishop for a day. He wore real vestments, delivered a mock sermon, and led processions. Real clergy stepped aside, symbolizing humility and the sacredness of childlike wisdom. Though playful, this ritual carried deep meaning. It reminded people that God could speak through the lowly, the young, the unexpected. To the chosen child, it was an enchantment, a brief chance to step into spiritual leadership, dressed in divine garments, walking among torches and chanting choirs. The shadow of death, and the light of celebration. It must be said, medieval childhood was dangerous. Many children didn't survive past age 5. Holidays were often stained with grief, missing faces, small graves behind the church, lullabies sung for the dead. But this made holy days even more urgent. Every child's laughter became sacred. Every shared meal, every candle lit by tiny hands was a triumph of hope over despair. Some parents dressed their children in white on major feast days, a symbol of spiritual armor. Others offered prayers at altars, weeping with both joy and fear. For children and adults alike, holidays became brief windows of heaven, reminders of a future kingdom where no child would die and no feast would ever end. Games, toys, and rhymes. When the church allowed it, and it often did during festive seasons, children played stickball, hoop rolling, and blind man's bluff. Toy hobby horses and simple dolls made of cloth or straw. Rhymes sung in circles, some of which survive today. Miniature maypoles for children's dances. Though small, these games served a social and spiritual purpose. They taught cooperation, rhythm, respect for seasons, and a sense of belonging to something greater. Children in the church's eyes. Clergy often preached that children were closest to God, not yet corrupted by the world. Jesus' words, "Let the little children come to me," echoed often on feast days. Many saints had childhood legends attached to them. St. Nicholas protecting boys and girls. St. Agnes, a child martyr, honored on her feast day by young girls. St. Martin sharing his cloak, a story told to children during winter. Children were not just seen as innocent, but as sacred symbols, living parables of faith, wonder, and vulnerability. The magic that kept the world turning. In the tapestry of medieval holiday life, children were not side characters. They were the thread of joy, the soul of every song, the laughter in every procession. Their wide eyes reflected the awe that adults longed to remember. Their voices, raised in carols or rhymes, reminded everyone that celebration was not just for the rich, the wise, or the powerful. It was for all who still believed in wonder. And in the flicker of candlelight on a child's face, in the muddy footprints of a barefoot dancer, in the whispered stories of miracles and dreams, the medieval world found its reason to hope again. Food, feasting, and the sacred table. In the medieval world, food was life, and feasting was divine theater. On most days, meals were sparse, repetitive, and driven by survival. But on holy days, everything changed. Feasting wasn't just about indulgence, it was a sacred act. A public performance of generosity, gratitude, and shared joy. A table became an altar. A loaf of bread became a blessing. And hunger, so familiar to many, was momentarily replaced by abundance and grace. Let's step into the kitchens, great halls, and fields of medieval feast days, where every dish told a story and every bite brought people closer to heaven. Ordinary hunger, the context of celebration. To understand what made holiday feasting so powerful, we must understand how little most people had the rest of the year. Daily meals for peasants often consisted of coarse rye bread, porridge, or vegetable stew. Meat was rare and saved for special occasions. Dairy was seasonal. Fruit and vegetables depended on weather and harvest. Winter brought near starvation for many. So when holidays arrived, they offered more than flavor. They offered relief, healing, and hope. It wasn't just food. It was salvation on a plate. Blessed meals, food as a spiritual act. Before the first bite was taken, feast foods were often blessed by clergy. Loaves of bread were marked with crosses or dipped in holy water. Salt, believed to purify and preserve, was used symbolically. Wine and ale were shared communally as symbols of the blood of Christ. Prayers were spoken aloud, even in homes, acknowledging that all abundance came from God. Churches held Holy Thursday meals, where food was shared with the poor, echoing the Last Supper. Monasteries cooked vast pots of lentil stew or barley gruel to feed anyone who came to the door. Even nobility saw feasting as part of their Christian duty, a performance of piety through plenty. Feast foods and symbolic dishes. On major holidays, the medieval table became a canvas for flavor, faith, and flair. Typical festival dishes included roasted boar or pig, often with apples in its mouth, symbolizing victory over darkness. Goose or duck, linked to fertility and seasonal change. Fish, especially on Fridays or during Lent. Pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and sometimes meat. Tarts and pies, filled with spiced fruit or minced meat. Wafers and honey cakes, especially for Easter and Epiphany. Eggs, dyed or gilded, symbolizing resurrection. Bread sculptures, loaves baked in shapes of lambs, fish, or crosses. Some feasts featured theatrical food, pies that sang, with live birds inside, sugar castles or spiced jelly shaped like saints. Food became both nourishment and narrative, the labor of love behind the meal. Feasts didn't magically appear, they were built by dozens of hands. Women began days in advance, grinding flour, brewing ale, boiling vegetables. Children helped knead, fetch, stir, and taste. Butchers prepared animals according to liturgical rules, no blood, symbolic cuts. Bakers shaped dough with care, sometimes adding herbs believed to ward off evil. In monasteries, kitchen monks followed recipes from ancient texts. In noble manors, cooks worked like artists, crafting elaborate presentations. Even in poor homes, everything was saved, everything used, because the feast had to be worthy of God's joy. Communal eating and sacred sharing. Feasts brought people together like nothing else. Villagers gathered in open fields, sitting on the ground or on shared benches. Tables were laid in churchyards, under trees, or in lordly halls. There was no privacy. Feasting was a public act, a way to affirm unity. Trenchers, flat bread plates, were used and then given to the poor. Ale was poured from large jugs and passed from hand to hand. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor. On feast days, everyone was meant to be fed, and the act of eating became a gesture of spiritual equality. Feast day etiquette and entertainment. Feasting was also about order and ritual. Grace was always said before and after meals. People ate in social order, nobles first, clergy second, peasants last. Songs were sung between courses, psalms, folk tunes, even comedic verse. Minstrels recited tales or played harps and pipes. Some tables had readers who told the lives of saints while others chewed. Feasts blended devotion, education, and enjoyment into one immersive ritual. Feasting and death, memento mori. It may seem strange, but even during joyful meals, medieval people were reminded of death. On All Souls' Day, people left bread and wine on graves. Skulls were sometimes carved into loaves. Priests reminded guests, "Eat now, for one day you will not." This wasn't meant to spoil the joy, it deepened it. Feasting in the shadow of death made every bite more sacred, more grateful, more full of light. Feasts of the church versus folk celebrations. Church feasts were structured, solemn, and symbolic. Easter, Christmas, Pentecost. with specific liturgies, fasts, and permitted foods. But folk feasts tied to older seasonal rhythms added earthy joy. Harvest festivals celebrated grain, wine, and apples. Midsummer included herb cakes, berry wines, and honey. May Day was filled with floral drinks and love potions. Together, these two traditions, sacred and seasonal, blended into a feast of the body and soul. A meal with heaven as guest. In a world ruled by hunger, the medieval feast was a moment of miraculous reversal. It said, "You are not forgotten. You are fed. You are loved." The bread was more than flour. The meat more than meat. It was blessing in tangible form, made by many hands, shared under candlelight, eaten to the sound of joy. And as long as people gathered at the sacred table, under church bells, by firelight, in fields or cathedrals, they knew that even in darkness light would return. The feast would come again. Rituals of light, fire, and sacred space. In a world without electricity, light was precious and symbolically powerful. To the medieval mind, light didn't just push back darkness. It defeated evil, revealed truth, and invited the divine. So it's no surprise that light, especially fire and candles, played a central role in medieval holiday rituals. These were not just decorations. They were acts of worship, deeply choreographed, rooted in both Christian theology and older pagan customs. Let us now walk into the darkness and witness how the people of the Middle Ages called forth sacred light. Candles as symbols of prayer and presence. In churches, candles weren't merely practical, they were sacred instruments. Altar candles burned continuously during major feast days, symbolizing the eternal presence of Christ. Villagers lit votive candles at the feet of saints, offering petitions or thanks. Processional candles, tall and mounted, were carried through towns in solemn parades. During Candlemas, February 2nd, the entire year's supply of candles was blessed by the priest, making them spiritually protective. Each flame was a prayer given shape. It burned with intention, with meaning, with a longing for heaven. Children and elders alike believed that a flickering flame could ward off evil, illness, and despair. Bonfires, from pagan roots to Christian rebirth. Large bonfires, often lit in the center of towns or on hilltops, were a staple of Midsummer, St. John's Eve, celebrating light at the peak of the sun's power. Easter Vigil, the night before Easter Sunday. Christmas Eve, symbolizing Christ as the light of the world. All Hallows Eve, driving out spirits and protecting the village from the dead. These fires had ancient roots, likely predating Christianity. But by the medieval era they had been baptized into Christian ritual. Villagers would toss herbs, flowers, and old tools into the flames. Prayers were said as embers flew skyward. Some walked around the fire 3 times invoking protection. Others leapt over flames to bring good fortune. The fire itself became a sermon without words, consuming the old, blessing the new, and lighting the path through the year's darkest moments. Illumination of sacred spaces. Feast days transformed both churches and homes into places of spiritual theater, using light as the main actor. Inside churches, windows were open to let in natural sunlight, often timed to fall on specific icons or relics. Tapestries with golden threads shimmered in candlelight. Lanterns were hung in arches and rafters. Colored glass cast ruby and sapphire hues across the stone. Outside, homes placed candles on windowsills or carved lanterns from gourds or horn. Roads were lined with torches, guiding pilgrims and guests. To walk through a village at night during a major holy day was to move through a glowing river of prayer. Symbolic use of fire and ritual. Fire was often more than light, it was part of the ritual itself. On Easter, the Paschal fire was kindled outside the church. From this one flame, all candles were lit, a reenactment of the resurrection. At Pentecost, burning herbs were tossed from balconies to symbolize the flames of the Holy Spirit descending. During plague times, purification fires were lit at crossroads, believed to cleanse the village of disease. Even cooking fires, like those used for feasting, were blessed on holidays, seen as holy hearths, where angels might dwell invisibly. Sacred light in folk practices. Not all fire rituals were controlled by the church. In rural areas, older folk customs still flickered in secret. Will-o'-the-wisp legends told of mysterious lights in marshes, leading travelers astray or toward hidden treasure. On solstices and equinoxes, some villagers performed quiet fire rituals in fields, asking for good harvests. In some places, young women floated candlelit wreaths down rivers, watching to see which one burned longest, a sign of future marriage or fortune. These practices weren't seen as rebellious. They were layers of memory, inherited from ancestors, reshaped by Christian meaning, held together by fire. Fire and vision, light as revelation. Light wasn't just symbolic of warmth. It was seen as the path to divine sight. Medieval mystics often describe visions as moments of being bathed in golden light. Churches were designed so that morning sun would strike the altar during key feasts. Light revealed the holy. It guided the lost. It pierced the veil between earth and heaven. To stand in light was to be seen by God. To hold it in your hands, even just a beeswax candle, was to hold a piece of eternal truth. Superstitions and warnings. Not all fire brought comfort. Medieval people believed that improper use of flame could summon darkness instead of banishing it. Letting a candle burn out completely without prayer could invite misfortune. Dropping a lantern in church might anger the saints. Seeing a fire burn blue was considered an omen of death. Lightning, fire from the sky, was seen as a direct punishment or warning from heaven. Thus, light was treated with ritual respect, always blessed, guarded, and reverenced. Light as the memory of paradise. In a world of cold winters and deeper fears, medieval people saw light as a holy guest, borrowed from paradise, sent to remind them they were not alone. Whether it danced on church walls, burned in a bonfire, or flickered quietly in a child's hands, light carried hope, history, and heaven's whisper. And as villagers gathered, their faces glowing in flame, their voices raised in prayer or laughter, they remembered what the holidays were truly for. To chase the dark away, not just from the world but from the heart. Music, bells, and the soundscape of celebration. In the medieval world, people couldn't read time from watches, but they could hear the calendar. Music, bells, and rhythm were not entertainment, they were divine architecture. They marked the hours, taught theology, and created emotional landscapes that wrapped around every celebration. To celebrate was to make sound, from hushed chants in a cloister to joyous songs in a muddy village lane. Let's now tune our ears to the world as they heard it. Bells, the voice of the village. Church bells were the heartbeat of medieval timekeeping. They rang to signal morning prayer, noon angelus, and evening rest. Announce births, deaths, marriages, and feast days. Warn of storms, fires, or approaching armies. Call the faithful to mass and processions. Each bell had a name, a tone, and a ritual of ringing. Some towers had carillons, complex arrays of bells played in sequence to create melodies. On feast days, bells rang more often and in longer, more jubilant peals. Special patterns of ringing, called changes, were used. Children were taught to recognize feast bells from ordinary tolls. To hear the bells on Christmas morning or Easter dawn was to feel the presence of God in sound. Chants, hymns, and sacred song. Inside the church, music was structured, sacred, and symbolic. Gregorian chant, slow, haunting melodies sung in Latin, was the sound of holiness. Monks and nuns sang in unison, believing harmony led to inner peace. On major feast days, choirs sang polyphony, layered melodies that echoed like angelic voices in stone halls. Each holiday had its own sequence of music. Pure Natus Estate for Christmas. Victimi Pascali Laudes for Easter. Dies Irae for All Souls. These songs weren't just music, they were theology in motion, telling stories of birth, resurrection, sacrifice, and glory. The faithful didn't just listen, they absorbed, memorized, and carried these melodies in their bones. Instruments of joy, folk music outside the church. Outside sacred walls, feasts came alive with the music of the people. Bagpipes, rebecks, flutes, and harps filled the air. Drums and tambourines kept time for dances. Singers roamed from house to house, telling tales in rhyme. In some towns, musicians were hired by the guilds or parishes to perform during processions or banquets. Folk songs celebrated the changing of seasons, stories of local saints or miracles, humor, love, and even light satire of the clergy. These melodies were simple, repetitive, and easily learned, passed down through generations. Children mimicked them with wooden pipes. Elders hummed them while baking bread. Everyone belonged to the song. Public performances, pageants, carols, and plays. Holiday music often spilled into full public performances. Mystery plays, telling Bible stories through drama and song. Mummers, masked villagers performing comic or heroic songs door to door. Caroling, groups singing outside homes, often in exchange for food or coin. During Christmas, wassailers carried cider bowls singing, "Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too." These were not private concerts. They were communal rites where music became part of gift-giving, storytelling, and joy. Silence is sacred sound. But sound wasn't constant. Just as powerful were the ritual silences of holy days. The moment after bells stopped ringing. The pause before the Easter hymn began. The hush as candles were lit in procession. The stillness before a prayer was whispered. In monasteries, great silence was kept from sundown to morning. No speech, only quiet breathing, distant owls, and the memory of song. Silence reminded people that even in stillness, God was present. The theology of sound. To medieval thinkers, music was not merely cultural. It was cosmic. They believed the stars and planets emitted perfect harmonies, the music of the spheres. Good music aligned the soul with heaven. Discordant notes were linked to sin or madness. Church leaders like St. Augustine taught that singing elevated the spirit, helping people ascend from earthly pain toward divine understanding. In this view, to sing on a holy day was not a luxury, it was a sacred duty. A world wrapped in sound. In every village, on every feast day, the medieval world became a symphony. Bells marked sacred time. Songs told stories older than memory. Instruments called people to dance, pray, remember. In joy and in mourning, in mass and in mud, music bound the people together, and bound their souls to heaven. And as they sang and clapped and played, they weren't just celebrating a day on the calendar. They were echoing creation itself, where God first spoke, and light, life, and song were born. Pilgrimage and holiday journeys. In the medieval world, holidays didn't always mean staying home. Sometimes they meant leaving everything behind, family, farm, safety, and stepping into the unknown. To go on pilgrimage was both a physical journey and a spiritual transformation. It was one of the most powerful forms of devotion available to ordinary people. You didn't need wealth, nobility, or education. You just needed faith and a willingness to walk. Many people planned their pilgrimages to coincide with holy feast days, when shrines were most active, the miracles most likely, and the joy most abundant. Let us walk now with them, from muddy villages to gleaming cathedrals, to see how the journey itself became the celebration. Why people went on pilgrimage. People went on pilgrimage for many reasons. To thank God for a miracle or healing. To seek forgiveness for sins or earn indulgences. To ask for fertility, health, rain, or victory. To honor a beloved saint or holy relic. To fulfill a vow made in crisis. To simply experience the sacred beyond their village. For some, it was mandatory penance ordered by a priest or court, walk to the shrine of St. James barefoot. For others, it was a dream of a lifetime, a trip they'd saved for over decades. And for many, it was the only time in their lives they'd leave home. Who were the pilgrims? Not just monks or nobles. Pilgrims were widows walking hundreds of miles with only bread and rosaries, blind men led by children, knights seeking forgiveness for war crimes, farmers, shoemakers, beggars, and barmaids, even entire families walking together. Pilgrimage was egalitarian in a world that was deeply unequal. On the road, all were dusty travelers sharing food, singing songs, watching each other's children, and whispering prayers under the stars. The great shrines and feast day celebrations. Some of the most popular pilgrimage destinations were alive with music, incense, and miracles during holidays. Santiago de Compostela in Spain, on St. James' Day, thousands flooded the cathedral. Canterbury in England, Pilgrims visited St. Thomas Becket's shrine, especially on his feast in July. Rome, flooded with pilgrims at Easter and Christmas. Mont Saint-Michel, Chartres, and Walsingham, local and regional favorites. These places came alive during feast days. Processions with relics, open-air masses, healing ceremonies and communal meals, bonfires, dancing and storytelling. Many shrines had miracle stories tied to feast days. People cured of blindness, storms calmed, lives changed. Whether or not they were true didn't matter. The belief itself healed something. The road life, inns, dangers, and discoveries. The journey wasn't easy. Roads were unsafe, bandits, wolves, illness. Inns could be crowded, filthy, or full of drunkards. Weather turned quickly. Pilgrims sometimes froze in the mountains or got stuck in flooded valleys. And yet, the road offered a rare freedom. You might meet people from 10 countries, hear 10 languages. You might learn a new song or prayer. You might see the sea for the first time, or eat a kind of bread you'd never tasted. At night, people shared stories by firelight. Some fell in love. Others confessed secrets they'd never spoken aloud. Many said the road changed them more than the shrine itself. Symbols and souvenirs of the journey. Pilgrims often wore or carried badges or tokens, like the scallop shell for Santiago or ampuli for Canterbury. Staffs and wide-brimmed hats. Pouches of earth or holy water from the shrine. Letters of blessing from priests. These objects told the world, I made the journey. And for many, they were buried with these items, hoping it would help their souls on their final pilgrimage to heaven. Ritual acts on the way. Each journey was filled with small rituals. Singing psalms as they walked. Stopping to pray at wayside crosses. Lighting candles at chapels or graves. Giving alms or sharing food with the poor. Washing in rivers before entering a holy site. Some pilgrims walked barefoot. Others wore sackcloth or kept silent the entire way. These were personal choices, signs of devotion. When they finally arrived, dusty, exhausted, many wept. Some kissed the ground. Others simply stood, unsure if the miracle they sought would come, but grateful nonetheless. Feast days on the road. Many pilgrims planned their journeys to arrive at shrines on major holidays like Easter, Assumption Day, August 15th, St. Michael's Day, September 29th, the Nativity of Mary, September 8th. These shrines transformed into cities of celebration. Tents and merchants lined the fields. Pilgrims slept under stars, sharing songs and soup. Monks gave sermons from balconies. Relics were paraded through candlelit streets. Musicians and storytellers performed all night. These moments were theaters of faith, where the sacred and ordinary collided under starlight and incense. Person kneeling going home, the return as a new self. The pilgrimage wasn't complete until the return. Some went home healed. Others returned disappointed, but changed. They brought stories, souvenirs, songs. Some had seen visions. Others found a sense of peace even without miracles. The village gathered to welcome pilgrims, who were now witnesses to something larger than their world. They had left as farmers or housewives, and returned as walkers of the Holy Road. Life as a sacred journey. In the end, every medieval holiday was a mini pilgrimage, from daily life into the sacred. And every real pilgrimage, timed with holy feasts, reminded people that life itself was a journey, with danger and joy, with loss and wonder, with companions and silence, with a holy destination waiting beyond the hills. And for a while, in the heat of the crowd, the quiet of the shrine, the echo of the bells, heaven didn't feel so far away. Holidays in the castle versus the cottage. In the medieval world, status meant everything. A person's birth determined what they wore, ate, prayed, and even how they celebrated. And yet, on holy days something shifted. The rich and poor may have lived in separate worlds, but during feast days both turned to the same church, lit the same candles, and sang the same hymns. Let's explore how holidays were lived at both ends of the medieval spectrum, from castles of grandeur to cottages of survival, and everything in between. The castle, holiday as performance. In a noble household, holidays were a chance to show wealth, power, and piety, all at once. Preparations began weeks in advance. Hunting parties sent out for venison, boar, and game birds. Tailors crafted new garments embroidered with family crests or religious symbols. Musicians and minstrels were hired for entertainment. Special masses and processions were arranged with the local clergy. On the feast day itself, nobles gathered in private chapels or attended cathedral services. Tables in the Great Hall were piled high with exotic foods: swan, peacock, spiced wine, sugared fruit. Tournaments or justs were often held for Christmas or saints' days. Nobles gave alms and leftover food to the poor, a mix of charity and duty. Everything was choreographed to reflect Christian virtue and social dominance. Even prayer was performative, spoken in Latin, read from illuminated manuscripts, witnessed by servants and guests. The cottage, holiday as survival and joy. For peasants, life was harsh, but holidays were a break from toil, a chance to feel human again. Though they had fewer resources, their celebrations were no less sacred. In preparation, families saved a few coins or hens throughout the year. Women baked special bread from their best flour. Old clothes were patched and washed for wearing to church. Children rehearsed simple songs or poems. On the feast day, the entire village walked to the local church, often barefoot, wearing their best clothes. After Mass, families returned home or gathered in fields to share meals. Simple stews, flatbread, cheese, apples, and ale were common. Storytelling, dancing, and music followed. Children played games with homemade toys or bundle sticks. There was laughter even if the table was humble. And every bite, every moment of rest, was cherished deeply. Shared rituals, what united them. Despite the vast class divide, the church was the great equalizer. Rich or poor, all were expected to attend Mass on feast days, confess sins and perform penance, light candles for deceased loved ones, participate in processions or prayers, keep liturgical fasts and feasts. The same calendar marked their lives. Whether in castle or cottage, Easter was Easter and Christmas was Christmas. And for a few moments in the church, kneeling side by side, a Lord and his servant were just souls before God. Food, luxury versus simplicity. Noble tables featured roasted swan, partridge, or peacock, sometimes served with feathers reattached for decoration. Imported spices from the East: cinnamon, cloves, saffron. Marzipan, candied fruit, honeyed pastries. Goblets of wine, silver serving ware, elaborate sugar sculptures. Peasant tables featured stewed beans, cabbage, and barley. Rare bits of pork or chicken saved all year. Herbal teas, flat ale, coarse rye bread. Shared trenchers and wooden cups. But for both, that single feast day could feel like a miracle. Entertainment and expression. In castles, musicians played lutes, harps, and viols. Dancers, acrobats, and fire breathers performed. Poetry, storytelling, and even courtly love games were shared. In villages, locals played bagpipes, drums, and whistles. People danced in circles, often around bonfires. Children performed skits or acted out saint stories. Neighbors told folk tales, often with humor, sorrow, and magic. Both worlds used sound, laughter, and rhythm to make the sacred day feel alive. Obligations of the rich, charity and control. For nobles, holiday joy came with expectation. Feed the poor or face criticism from the church. Attend public mass or be accused of arrogance. Fund local festivals, plays, or repairs to chapels. Sometimes, nobles hosted mass feasts in their great halls, allowing peasants to sit separately and eat from simpler dishes, a display of generosity and power. Others gave coin or bread tokens outside their gates. These acts weren't always selfless, but they did create moments of community where the lines of power temporarily softened. Festive clothing and visual splendor. For the rich, velvet, brocade, fur-lined robes. Embroidered gowns with gold thread. Rings, belts, and jeweled headpieces. Colors like deep blue, crimson, and green, all expensive. For the poor, clean tunics or patched wool garments. Simple floral crowns for young girls. Painted wooden crosses or homemade pins. Colors mostly of earth and plant dyes. Still, even the poorest child felt like a prince for a day, because on feast days dignity didn't depend on money. two celebrations, one spirit. Medieval holidays were mirrors of the world's inequalities and its unity. One group feasted under vaulted ceilings with silver knives. The other danced by firelight and shared soup from clay bowls. But both groups looked to the same sky, listened to the same bells, prayed the same prayers. And in that shared light, of candles, music, and hope, they remembered, joy belongs to everyone, not because of wealth, but because of faith. Forbidden joy, when the church tried to ban fun. We often imagine the medieval church as the joyful heart of holidays. But the truth is more complex. In many parts of Europe, church authorities feared joy that was too loud, too earthy, too full of wine, fire, music, and masks. Because joy, uncontrolled, could lead to sin, to lust, violence, mockery, and rebellion. So while the calendar was full of holy feasts, it was also full of restrictions, warnings, and even bans. This is the story of how joy, especially folk joy, became a battlefield between sacred authority and everyday people. The church's worry, joy as disorder. Why would the church want to control fun? Because joy, especially collective, physical, noisy joy, threatened their ideals of order, humility, and moral control. Dancing could turn into sexual temptation. Mockery of lords or clergy could turn into rebellion. Drunkenness could lead to violence. Masked festivals blurred lines between right and wrong. Many priests feared that joy, unregulated, would awaken the chaos beneath the surface of society. And so they set rules, edicts and bans. Across Europe, from the 12th to the 15th centuries, local bishops and councils issued decrees banning dancing in churchyards after Mass, theatrical plays that portrayed saints in humorous ways, women singing or leading music in public, bonfire jumping especially during midsummer, cross-dressing or masking during carnival. Some towns banned feasting before sunrise or celebrations after sunset. Others outlawed instruments like bagpipes or drums during holy days. Even church bells were sometimes silenced during certain fasts, to keep things somber. And punishments could be severe, from fines and lashes to excommunication. The target, carnival and misrule. No holiday worried the church more than carnival, the weeks before Lent. Carnival was wild. People wore masks, switched clothes with the opposite gender. They elected mock kings or bishops who parodied religious figures. Villagers roasted meat, drank heavily, and danced in the streets. Plays mocked local lords and even Christ's Passion. To many church leaders, this was blasphemy dressed up as fun. They called it the Feast of Fools, and tried repeatedly to ban or limit it. But carnival kept returning, louder, funnier, more daring. Because for ordinary people, carnival was a sacred release, a ritual of chaos before the discipline of Lent, folk traditions and pagan shadows. The church was also nervous about older, non-Christian traditions that refused to die out. Maypole dancing, lighting fires at solstices or equinoxes, harvest chants and fertility rites, wearing animal masks. Though many of these customs had been Christianized, their pagan roots were visible and unsettling to church authorities. Rural people often celebrated these holidays with deep emotion and secret prayers. But because they fell outside strict Christian ritual, they were seen as dangerous remnants of the old world. In some places, priests even declared such customs to be witchcraft, and demanded they be burned, suppressed, or confessed. Dance in the body, too much joy? Dancing was a special target. Many priests, especially in Northern Europe, preached that public dancing led to moral decay. Men and women touching, laughing, sweating, singing together. Unmarried youths staying out past dark. These scenes seemed innocent, but to the church they were filled with lust and temptation. Some bishops went so far as to ban dancing altogether during holy days. But villagers still danced. In fields after Mass by moonlight. Because dancing was not just fun, it was a form of prayer, of release, of being alive. Mockery, satire, and sacred space. Another problem, humor. Villagers often used festivals to mock those in power, dressing as priests or nobles, putting the devil on trial in parodies, writing funny plays about biblical stories. For the church, this crossed a line. Sacred things were to be revered, not ridiculed. But for the people, laughing at fear was healing. To joke about death, power, and even God was a way to survive suffering. Some church leaders understood this. Others condemned it fiercely. Resistance and quiet rebellion. Despite bans, restrictions, and sermons, people kept celebrating. Secret fires were lit in valleys and fields. Songs were passed down in whispers. Forbidden plays were performed in barns, forests, and alleyways. Children were taught the old dances in private. Even many local priests looked the other way, joining in, laughing, dancing, blessing food, and remembering they were human too. Because joy, real joy, is hard to kill. The power of joy. In trying to control joy, the medieval church revealed something important. Joy is powerful. Joy is sacred. Joy is dangerous. And in every village, behind every sermon and warning, people remembered that joy. Healed broken hearts. United the poor and the rich. Defied the cold of winter. Brought beauty to a cruel world. In the end, joy survived not because it was allowed, but because it was needed. And in every feast, fire, and song, the people claimed their joy, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, always faithfully. Children of the feast, holiday joy through a child's eyes. In the harsh world of the Middle Ages, childhood was short. Most children began working young, faced illness, hunger, and often, early death. But on feast days, something changed. The adult world paused. Work stopped. Bells rang. Candles were lit. And suddenly the ordinary became enchanted. To children, holidays were not theological arguments or social performances. They were color and sound, sweetness and laughter, a rare time when they felt safe, joyful, and free. Let us now walk into the feast through a child's small, wonder-filled eyes, and rediscover what celebration truly meant. Waking up to a feast day. A child's excitement began the night before. Mothers whispered, "Tomorrow is the saint's day." Special bread dough was left to rise overnight. The best tunic or shift was laid out. Elders told stories of the holiday's miracles, monsters, or saints. Children might go to bed hungry. Fasting before a holy day was common, but they dreamed of bells, fire, and sweetness. At dawn, the whole village changed. Fathers carried garlands to the chapel. Siblings lit candles together. The air smelled of honey cakes and ash. And the child's eyes grew wide. Today is holy. Gifts and goodies. While gifts were rare in medieval life, feast days sometimes brought special surprises for children. A piece of fruit like an apple or fig. A tiny wooden toy hand-carved by a grandfather. Honey bread or a cup of warmed milk. A ribbon, a blessed charm, or even a tiny bell worn around the neck. For a poor child, these were not gifts, they were treasures. And the memory of receiving them could last a lifetime. Games, toys, and play. After church, when the village allowed it, play exploded in the fields. Children played. Blind man's bluff, catch stone, ring around, and leap games. Stick races and rolling wooden hoops. Dressing up like saints, animals, or angels. Chasing each other with chalked faces, acting out plays or folk tales. In wealthier homes, some children played with miniature knights and horses, tiny musical instruments, painted wooden dolls, games carved into stone floors or wooden boards, early versions of tic-tac-toe or drafts. These games weren't distractions, they were rituals of joy. And on holy days, even priests looked the other way when laughter echoed too loud. Learning through ritual. Children learned faith not from doctrine, but from ritual and repetition. Holding candles during processions. Singing simple Latin refrains during Mass. Carrying flowers to the Virgin statue. Watching older siblings reenact saints' martyrdoms. Touching relics with trembling fingers. They didn't understand every word, but they felt the awe, the silence, the glow. The smell of incense, the drone of chants, and the sparkle of gold on a chalice became part of their inner memory, their spiritual DNA. The family feast. Back home, the meal wasn't fancy, but it was sacred. Families gathered around shared bowls. Parents let children eat first, or at least freely. Children were allowed extra honey, apples, or a sip of ale. A grandmother told the story of the saint whose day it was. Children laughed, spilled food, teased each other, and no one scolded them. Because for once, joy was not a luxury but a right. Stories, saints, and fear. Feast days were also a time for teaching through tales. Stories of St. George slaying the dragon, the cruel fate of St. Lucy, or the miracles of St. Nicholas. Tales of heaven and hell, angels and demons. Sometimes stories were terrifying, especially for young ears. But these stories gave children a moral map. They taught, be kind, be brave, be honest, fear God but also love Him. And they linked every holiday to a larger cosmic story. Magic and folklore. Children were closest to folklore, to the edges where official religion met ancient belief. Some children believed fairies visited on certain feast days, that you could see ghosts on All Hallows Eve, that fireflies on a saint's day were angel sparks, that flowers opened at midnight on Easter and whispered secrets. Whether real or imagined, these beliefs added mystery and magic to celebration, the feeling that anything could happen. Not all joy was guaranteed. Some children, of course, were orphaned, sick, or bound to labor. For them, holidays offered only brief glimpses of joy, a stolen moment of song, a warm crust of bread from a stranger, a quiet candle lit in memory of a lost mother. But even these children believed in saints, in God, in the idea that joy would someday return. And on feast days, even if no one saw them, they danced. A child's feast of memory. For medieval children, holidays planted seeds that lasted forever. Long after they grew up, lost faith, or grew bitter, they remembered the smell of bread at dawn, the sound of bells in the cold air, the thrill of new shoes or a paper crown, the warmth of a mother's lap during Mass. Holidays taught them what mattered: light in darkness, warmth in winter, joy after hunger, and perhaps most importantly, that they mattered. Holy fire and sacred light, candles, bonfires, and symbolism. In the Middle Ages, darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence. Nightfall was feared, a time when demons whispered and wolves howled. And so, on holy days, people turned to fire, not just for warmth, but as a spiritual weapon, a symbol of Christ's presence and a tool of community memory. From the small flame of a baptismal candle to towering midsummer bonfires, fire and light were central to the medieval experience of celebration. Let's journey into this world of sacred glow and burning belief, where the flicker of a flame meant more than words ever could. Candles in the church, sacred light of God. In every medieval church, light came from one source: beeswax candles. Expensive and rare, these candles were reserved for sacred use. Each one represented the purity of Christ. Beeswax made from virgin bees, fire from heaven. The Paschal candle, lit on Easter Eve, symbolized Christ's resurrection, carried into a dark church, the flames spreading like hope. On major feast days, churches glowed with hundreds of candles on altars and statues. Priests read scripture beside guttering light, their faces half-shadowed. Candles were lit for the dead, for healing, for protection. And when the service ended, some villagers would cup their hands around the flame, as if catching a blessing. The hearth is holy space. At home, the fire in the hearth was sacred, especially on feast days. On Christmas Eve, many families let the Yule log burn all night, its smoke believed to bless the household. During Holy Week, fires were extinguished on Good Friday, then relit from the church flame on Easter. Some villagers kept a coal from the festival fire to protect livestock or heal sickness. Fire wasn't just heat. It was life itself, and on feast days it was watched, guarded, and prayed over. Bonfires in the Old Faith. One of the most powerful and controversial forms of holiday celebration was the bonfire. On certain feast days especially. Midsummer's Eve, June 23rd. St. John's Day. All Hallows Eve, October 31st. Winter solstice. Villages lit massive fires in the fields. These fires had ancient roots, predating Christianity. They were meant to ward off evil spirits, protect crops and cattle, strengthen the sun as seasons turned, bring fertility to the land and people. People would leap through the flames, sing, dance in circles, and throw offerings into the fire. Some would carry torches from the bonfire to their homes, believing the flame brought luck, cleansing, or fertility. The church sometimes banned these rites, but rarely succeeded. Because to the people, these fires were sacred in a way the altar could not match. They touched the earth, the sky, and the soul, lighting the darkness in processions. Many holidays involved candle processions, especially the Feast of Candlemas, February 2nd, Corpus Christi, the Nativity, Easter Vigil. Villagers walked in solemn lines, children holding tiny taper candles, nuns carrying lanterns veiled in linen, priests with gilded candlesticks and incense smoke curling into the dusk. These processions were theatrical, part ritual, part mystery play, part living prayer. The sight of hundreds of flames moving in rhythm, against the wind, against the dark, became a symbol of Christian unity and divine power. Symbols in the flame. Fire carried many meanings in medieval minds. Light of Christ, pure, guiding, unending. The Holy Spirit, as at Pentecost, flames on the apostles' heads. Judgment and hell, the fire that burned the wicked. Transformation, a soul cleansed by suffering and flame. Memory, candles burned for the dead, for saints, for the unborn. A candle was often lit with a whispered name. A fire was sometimes wept beside after a loss. And every child was taught that a flame must be honored, never wasted, never mocked. Fire and the dead. On All Souls' Day and other mourning feasts, candles became bridges to the dead, lit on graves, or carried to the edge of town, placed in windows to guide wandering spirits home. Prayers whispered into flame, may their soul find rest. Some believed the dead could see the light from purgatory. Others believed the flame carried the prayer like smoke to heaven. Superstition and fire. Fire also became wrapped in folk belief. If a candle flickered wildly, a soul was near. If a fire went out suddenly, it meant an omen. On certain nights, people placed herbs in the fire to protect babies, animals, or the harvest. Fire dances, performed by barefoot women or masked villagers, were believed to bless the land. The church often called these acts pagan remnants, and tried to replace them with liturgical processions. But villagers continued both, one at the altar, one in the field, because they knew God spoke in both places. The light that endures. In the medieval world, light was more than physics. It was presence, protection, promise. A candle lit for a sick child. A torch lifted in prayer. A bonfire against the howling dark. In every flicker, the people saw something eternal. On feast days, they did not simply see the light. They became it. A calendar of faith, mapping the year through feasts. The year wasn't counted in months, it was lived from one holy day to the next. In the medieval world, time itself was holy. People didn't think in weeks or weekends. They thought in terms of after Michaelmas, before Candlemas, or on the eve of St. John. The church gave them more than prayers. It gave them a calendar of meaning, where every month, every season, was filled with ritual, memory, and purpose. Let's walk through a medieval year, one feast at a time. Winter, darkness, hope, and the birth of light. December to February. When nights were longest and fields lay barren, winter brought some of the most beloved and sacred holidays. Advent, late November, December. A time of waiting marked by fasting and candlelight. Villagers hung evergreens and prepared their hearts for Christ. Christmas, December 25th. Not just a day, but 12 full days of celebration. Songs, feasts, nativity plays, and the burning of the Yule log. Feast of St. Stephen, December 26th. A day for alms and care for the poor. Epiphany/Three Kings Day, January 6th. Celebrating the arrival of the Magi, often marked with gifts for children and dramatic reenactments. Candlemas, February 2nd. The blessing of candles, symbolizing light entering the world, a moment of warmth in the coldest season. Winter was a season of darkness softened by fire, of deep cold broken by song and miracle. Spring, renewal, fasting, and resurrection. March to May. As snow melted and life returned, so did movement and emotion in the calendar. Lent, 40 days before Easter. A long, solemn fast. No meat, no weddings, no celebrations. A time of reflection and prayer. Palm Sunday. Villagers carried real or woven branches. Children acted out the procession into Jerusalem. A Holy Week. Each day was sacred. Maundy Thursday saw foot washing rituals. Good Friday brought mourning. fires were extinguished. Easter, the most important day of the year. At midnight, the Paschal candle was lit. People wept, sang, and feasted. Rogation Days, May. Priests led processions around fields, blessing crops and calling on saints to protect the land. Ascension Day and Pentecost. Symbols of spiritual rising and fire, often accompanied by flower processions, songs, and dances. Spring was a season of hunger and hope, ending in explosive joy. Summer, light, growth, and saints of fire. June to August. This was the time of festivals in the open, of bonfires, dancing, and celebrating earth and sky. Midsummer/St. John's Day, June 23rd to 24th. One of the oldest, most beloved holidays. Villagers leapt through fire, bathed in rivers, and sang all night. A mix of Christian and ancient rites. Feast of Saints Peter and Paul, June 29th. Marked by bell ringing and candle processions. The Assumption of Mary, August 15th. Churches were filled with flowers. Girls wore white. People believed the sky opened and miracles could happen. A harvest blessings. Though not one official feast, many towns held late summer blessings. Priests would walk through fields with incense, thanking God for grain and bread. Summer was the season of celebrating the earth, of faith woven with nature, of light that felt unending. Autumn, labor, saints, and the dance with death. September to November. As the air cooled and days shortened, the calendar turned toward protection, reflection, and the afterlife. Michaelmas, September 29th. Celebrating Saint Michael the Archangel. A time of contracts, land payments, and hiring new servants. A boundary between summer and winter. All Hallows Eve/All Saints Day/All Souls Day, October 31st to November 2nd. 3 days dedicated to the dead, the saints, and the living faithful. Bonfires, soul cakes, candlelit processions to cemeteries. Martinmas, November 11th. A feast before the fast. Geese were eaten. Wine was tasted. The last big party before winter locked the world again. Advent began again at the end of November, a sacred circle returning. Autumn was a time of harvest and haunting, of saying goodbye to the land and remembering what lies beyond. The structure of sacred time. Medieval people lived in 2 calendars. The agricultural year, sowing, growing, reaping, resting. The liturgical year, Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, saints' feasts. The church made sure the 2 matched, blessing seeds, animals, bread, water, and even wine during holy days. Time was not neutral. Time was holy. Every season was a sermon, every month a prayer. Major feast categories. The calendar had different levels of feasts. Solemnities, biggest Easter, Christmas, Pentecost. Feasts, saints, apostles, major church events. Memorials, local or lesser-known saints. Fasting days, black letter days, no celebration, penance required. Each village might have its own patron saint, adding more local color, including parish processions, miracle reenactments, special foods and games unique to that village. Living from feast to feast. In the medieval mind, time was not a flat line. It was a circle, a sacred spiral. Every candle lit on Christmas Eve echoed the candle lit last year, and every Easter Mass reminded villagers of the one they heard as children. Through feasts, fasts, and fire, they mapped their lives through meaning. In the end, to live in the Middle Ages was to live in a tapestry of time, stitched together by bells, bread, and belief. And that tapestry wrapped every soul, rich or poor, in ritual, memory, and light. Women and holiday ritual, between the hearth and the altar. They weren't always in the stories. But they lit the candles, baked the bread, sang the hymns, and kept the memory of feast days alive. In the official records of medieval feasts, men dominate, priests giving sermons, lords hosting banquets, monks writing calendars. But behind every holiday's light, music, and ritual was the unseen labor of women. They were the keepers of tradition, emotion, and sacred routine, whether they lived in castles, cottages, or cloisters. Let's lift the veil and step into their world, where feast days meant more work, more devotion, and more quiet power than any history book admits. Feasts begin in the kitchen. Before the church bells rang or the candles were lit, women were already working. waking before dawn to knead dough for special bread, stirring pots of pottage, sweetening oats with honey for the children, plucking herbs from small gardens to season meat, making soul cakes for All Hallows, Twelfth Night pies, or Easter pastries shaped like crosses or lamps. For many women, feast days didn't mean rest, they meant preparation. The mother or grandmother wasn't just a cook, she was a ritualist, ensuring every dish was seasonal, symbolic, and sacred, passing down ritual and memory. Women were often the oral historians of their families and villages, teaching children the proper songs and prayers, explaining why we light this candle or why we eat this bread today, telling stories of miracles, saints, and family traditions, making sure daughters knew when and how to fast, bless, or give thanks. Holiday memory was passed down not in books, but in kitchens, laps, and whispered stories. The church may have preached doctrine, but mothers taught faith. Queens and ladies, feast day leaders. In noble courts, elite women often played major ceremonial roles, organizing banquets for holy days, designing the seating, foods, and entertainment, patronizing mystery plays or pageants for Easter and Christmas, leading charity efforts on feast days, distributing bread, alms, or blankets to the poor, hosting pilgrims and clerics, ensuring the estate reflected Christian hospitality. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of Castile were not just figures of wealth, they were guardians of religious tradition. And even lesser noble women held influence through ritual, donation, and feast hosting. Nuns in the sacred rhythm. In convents, women lived according to the liturgical clock, a life of prayer and preparation. Nuns spent days crafting altar cloths, festival banners, and illuminated manuscripts. They sang the divine office daily, chants that marked every hour and feast. On holy days, they prepared special meals, dramas, and sermons within their cloisters. Some convents held their own processions, where nuns carried candles, relics, or statues. Though cloistered, nuns shaped religious culture in ways few lay people ever saw. They were custodians of the sacred calendar, and their work rippled out into every nearby village. Hidden labor and devotion. In small homes across Europe, laywomen held quiet but powerful spiritual authority, lighting candles for saints' feast days, even when men mocked them, washing children and dressing them properly for holy days, preparing home altars with flowers, icons, and relics, nursing the sick with herbs on healing feasts like St. Blaise's Day or St. Apollonia's. They often went unnoticed, yet kept tradition alive and embodied. Many knew the feast days by heart, not by reading but by watching the moon, the weather, and the village mood. Folk rituals and feminine power. Some of the most ancient, pre-Christian traditions were preserved and practiced by women, often secretly, often blended with church ritual. Leading circle dances on Midsummer's Eve, teaching girls charms and songs for fertility or protection, placing herbs or ashes in food for blessing, whispering prayers to saints while braiding bread or spinning wool. These rituals weren't superstition to them, they were faith in daily life. And even when the church disapproved, women kept them alive, not to rebel but to protect. Struggles and silencing. Of course, women also faced limits and punishment. Some were accused of witchcraft for performing old feast rituals. Others were banned from church processions or public religious roles. Many couldn't read scripture, they needed men to interpret it. Yet through song, gesture, and practice, women still claimed a place in the sacred space. Some even became mystics, like Julian of Norwich or Hildegard of Bingen, whose feast day visions and music shaped centuries of Christian thought. Feasts of womanhood. Several feast days were centered on women, offering them spiritual models and moments of public honor. The Annunciation, March 25th, celebrating Mary's yes to God. The Visitation, May 31st, two pregnant women, Mary and Elizabeth, sharing joy. The Assumption, August 15th, honoring Mary's rising. Women wore white and carried flowers. St. Margaret's Day, St. Bridget's Day, St. Anne's Day, feasts linked to motherhood, fertility, and wisdom. These feasts affirmed that womanhood itself was sacred, even if society often forgot it. The silent keepers of celebration. Women did not always stand at the altar, but they lit the way there. They stirred pots and taught prayers between spoons and lullabies. They embroidered saints into fabric, baked miracles into bread, and whispered old songs into new generations. They were the ones who said, "Today is a holy day," and by their hands, feast days came to life. Echoes of celebration, how medieval holidays live on today. We no longer live in castles or worship by candlelight, but somewhere in the scent of pine, the sound of bells, the warmth of fire, the medieval feast lives on. The Middle Ages are over. The bells no longer toll across the valley to call us to Massachusetts. The saints' days are not inked in red on every calendar. The fear of devils in the dark no longer governs our nights. But somehow their holidays, the fire, the music, the story, survive. They've changed. They've faded. But they're still here in whispers and echoes. Let's follow the thread of tradition from the medieval world into our own, and discover how we still carry their feasts in our hearts. Christmas, from candlelight to fairy lights. The most obvious survivor of medieval celebration is Christmas. The 12 days of Christmas? They're medieval. Caroling in the streets? Medieval minstrels and processionals. Decorating with holly, ivy, and evergreens? An ancient winter solstice tradition, reimagined by the church. The Yule log? Burn then. Chocolate now. But still a symbol of warmth and survival. Even Santa Claus has roots in Saint Nicholas of Myra, whose medieval feast involved secret gift-giving to children. Though today's Christmas is commercial and global, beneath the tinsel lies a deeply medieval soul, one of light in darkness, feast after hunger, and hope in the coldest season. Easter and Lent, fasting, feasting, and the flowering cross. Easter today is filled with eggs, once a forbidden food during Lent. Bunnies, symbols of rebirth with ancient roots. Sunrise services echoing medieval vigil masses. Palm Sundays with children waving branches just like they did in 1300. The 40 days of Lent, now often symbolic, once shaped every meal, mood, and prayer in the medieval calendar. Even if we fast from sugar or social media, the rhythm still holds. And when churches cover statues in purple or place lilies near the altar, they're reenacting what countless nuns, priests, and mothers did 1,000 years ago. Halloween and All Saints, the forgotten festival of the dead. Before it became candy and costumes, Halloween was sacred. All Hallows Eve, October 31st, a night to pray for the dead and ward off evil. All Saints' Day, November 1st, to honor the named holy ones. All Souls' Day, November 2nd, for the forgotten, the ordinary, the beloved dead. In medieval villages, people lit candles in windows to guide spirits, ate soul cakes and said prayers at each door, believed the veil between worlds was thin. Today we wear masks, once thought to confuse evil spirits. We light jack-o'-lanterns, once turnips carved to scare away ghosts. And even if we don't know it, we're still dancing in the shadow of medieval firelight. May Day, Midsummer, and forgotten folk feasts. In some rural places, maypole dances still happen. In Sweden, bonfires still blaze for St. John's Eve. And across Europe, harvest festivals echo Lammas, or the blessing of the bread. We no longer leap over fire or walk the fields with incense, but we still gather for spring picnics, hold flower festivals, burn fireworks in midsummer, bless children and animals in ceremonies, just like medieval villagers did. These seasonal pulses, once deeply spiritual, now live as cultural habits, but the soul remains. Saints in the shadows, quiet remnants. Though many people no longer celebrate them, Saints' Days still exist. Valentine's Day began as a feast for a martyred priest. St. Patrick's Day has turned from holy remembrance to cultural pride. St. Lucy's Day in Scandinavia keeps the memory of light amid winter's darkness. Even the phrase "a red-letter day" comes from medieval calendars, where holy days were literally written in red. Time still wears the old shape. You may not realize it, but even our modern calendar still carries the bones of the liturgical year. Sunday is a holy day. Holiday equals holy day. The weekend off, a distant echo of feast day rest. Easter shifting by moon cycles, just as it did for medieval bishops and monks. Every time you feel the December hush, the April bloom, or the October chill, you're stepping into a rhythm laid down centuries ago. The feast endures. We may not chant in Latin, We may not light candles for St. Blaise or fast for Michaelmas, but in every fire we gather around, every bell we ring, every table we set with love and memory, we carry the feast forward. Because the true meaning of the medieval holy day wasn't just faith, it was connection to the earth, to the divine, to each other. And as long as we celebrate something, anything, we are still part of that ancient, flickering procession. So light the candle, pour the wine, tell the story, and feast, because this too is holy. Theater and celebration, plays, parables, and the sacred stage. Before books, before movies, there were stories acted by torchlight, in churches and muddy village squares. Before people could read the Bible, they watched it come alive. From the towering cathedrals of France to the dirt roads of English villages, drama and storytelling became a central part of religious celebration. Theater wasn't entertainment. It was instruction, emotion, and ritual. And feast days weren't just for eating and praying, they were for watching, performing, and remembering. Let's step backstage and into the sacred world of medieval drama. The origins, from altars to aisles. In the early Middle Ages, churches began using dramatic elements to explain complex biblical stories. Priests acted out the resurrection on Easter. Monks played the Three Marys visiting the tomb. Altars became stages with robes, props, and candlelight. These small reenactments, called liturgical dramas, were meant to teach, not entertain, especially since most people couldn't read Latin. Soon these mini-plays expanded. They moved from altars to courtyards and then into the streets, carried by the people themselves. Mystery plays, the Bible in living color. By the 13th and 14th centuries, entire biblical cycles were performed across towns on major feast days, especially Corpus Christi. These were called mystery plays because they were organized by medieval mystery or craft guilds, bakers, blacksmiths, etc. Key features. Each guild performed one scene. The shipwrights did Noah's Ark, the butchers acted the crucifixion. Plays were performed on rolling wagons or in designated town squares. Language was vernacular, not Latin, so common people could understand and feel. They included props, costumes, sound effects, even stage machinery. A full cycle could take an entire day or several days. A true public spectacle, blending worship with wonder. Comedy, devils, and human emotion. These plays weren't dry sermons. They were raw, emotional, and surprisingly funny. The devil characters were crowd favorites, leaping, shrieking, taunting the audience, and being chased by angels. Noah's wife often refused to get on the ark, a comic domestic argument the crowd loved. Soldiers mocked Christ before the crucifixion. Their jeering was brutal, real, and shocking. The Last Judgment scene showed souls being dragged to hell, complete with fire, chains, and screams. These moments taught more than fear, they made biblical truth tangible. And for a population that rarely saw drama, this was unforgettable. Church approval and censorship. At first, the church supported mystery plays, they taught scripture and engaged the faithful. But as time went on, plays became more theatrical, less reverent. Some included improvised jokes or political satire. Women began acting, especially in France and Italy. Local groups added folk legends and pagan themes. This led to growing tension. Some bishops began banning outdoor plays or limiting guild involvement. Still, the tradition persisted for centuries, especially in England, France, Germany, and Spain. Morality plays, virtue, vice, and the soul's journey. Later in the Middle Ages, another form of sacred drama emerged, the morality play. Unlike mystery plays, which retold Bible stories, morality plays were allegories, teaching moral lessons through symbolic characters. The most famous was Everyman, where the main character, Everyman, is told he must face death. He seeks help from friends, fellowship, riches, beauty, all abandon him. Only good deeds stays by his side. He learns that only spiritual virtue matters in the end. These plays were simpler but deeply philosophical and emotional, often performed in schools, guild halls, or monastery gardens. Holiday-specific performances. Certain feast days had unique dramas. Christmas, nativity plays with shepherds and angels. Sometimes local babies played the Christ child. Easter, passion plays, often deeply violent, depicting scourging and crucifixion. Epiphany, the visit of the Magi with elaborate costumes and gifts. Feast of Fools, now suppressed comic plays mocking clergy and mixing sacred with ridiculous. In some regions, entire villages participated, with actors, musicians, costume makers, and storytellers all working together. It wasn't just a show, it was a community ritual. Women, children, and the dramatic tradition. Though often restricted, women and children found ways to participate. As singers, narrators, costume assistants. Girls played angels or saints in cloister plays. In convents, nuns wrote and acted in religious dramas, especially during Christmas or Marian feasts. In rural areas, young girls led candlelight dances or sang songs between acts. These roles may have been small, but they ensured that the sacred story lived on generation after generation. Legacy, from sacred drama to modern theater. Many scholars believe that medieval religious plays laid the foundation for modern theater. Use of character arcs, dialogue, and symbolic staging. Themes of virtue versus vice, heaven and hell, fate and free will. Structure of acts, cues, and ensemble performance. Even Shakespeare borrowed techniques and structures from morality plays, blending sacred tradition with Renaissance innovation. So when we sit in a theater today, or even watch a religious movie, we're echoing a medieval feast day, staged centuries ago in a muddy town square. A stage for the soul. Medieval theater was not about applause. It was about reminding people who they were, why they mattered, and what came after this life. Let them laugh at devils, weep at Christ, cheer for angels, watch heaven and hell collide on a wooden platform. In the flicker of torchlight, with a shepherd's flute and a blacksmith's voice, eternity became a story. And though the actors are gone and the stage is dismantled, the echo remains. The sacred play never really ended. It just changed costumes.